I stood in front of my bedroom mirror at 6:30 a.m., adjusting the conservative black blazer one final time. Beneath the starched white blouse and sensible wool skirt, I wore the crimson silk lingerie set my soon-to-be ex-husband had bought me for our 5th wedding anniversary. The same set he'd once called his favorite. The same set he'd photographed me wearing in this very room when our marriage still held promise instead of poison. Today, I would follow his instructions to dress modestly for our final custody hearing. Today, I would be the picture of propriety he demanded. And today, his own expectations would finally destroy him. The irony wasn't lost on me as I fastened the pearl necklace his mother had given me, another symbol of the perfect Southern wife I tried so hard to become. In 3 hours, I would walk into the Dougherty County Courthouse in Albany, Georgia, wearing exactly what my controlling husband had demanded, while the evidence that would end his manipulative reign lay hidden in my lawyer's briefcase like a loaded weapon. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story really began 18 months ago, when I first discovered that the man I'd married wasn't the devoted husband and father he pretended to be. Michael James Thompson had been Albany's golden boy long before I met him at a church social in 2018. Third-generation lawyer at Thompson & Associates, the law firm his grandfather had founded in 1962. Deacon at First Baptist Church, member of the Albany Country Club, the kind of man every Southern mother hoped her daughter would bring home. Handsome, successful, and steeped in the traditional values that still held sway in our corner of South Georgia. I was 26 when we married, fresh out of Albany State University with a degree in art therapy and stars in my eyes. Michael was 32, established, confident. He swept me off my feet with expensive dinners, weekend trips to Savannah, and promises of the life we'd build together. He wanted children, he said, a stable home, a wife who understood the importance of reputation in a small southern city where everyone knew everyone else's business. For the first few years, I tried to be exactly what he wanted. I abandoned my plans to work with trauma victims at the regional medical center, instead taking a part-time position at an elementary school where my schedule would accommodate his needs. I learned to make his grandmother's famous peach cobbler. I joined the Junior League and the Church Ladies Auxiliary. I dressed conservatively for his business functions and social events, keeping my small shoulder tattoo, a delicate wildflower I'd gotten in college, carefully hidden beneath sleeves and scarves. Michael approved of these changes with the satisfaction of a man molding clay into his desired shape. He would nod approvingly when I appeared at his side in navy blazers and knee-length skirts, my auburn hair styled in the neat chignon his mother had suggested. He introduced me to colleagues and clients as my lovely wife, Anna, always with his hand possessively placed on my lower back, a subtle signal of ownership that I mistook for protection. Our daughter Lily was born in 2021, and for a brief, shining moment, I thought we might finally be the family I'd dreamed of. Michael doted on her in those early weeks, showing off photos to anyone who would look. He hired a nanny so I could maintain my reduced work schedule, though he made it clear that Lily's needs came before any professional aspirations I might harbor. I was grateful for his provision, his stability, his unwavering certainty about how our life should unfold. But private Michael was different from public Michael, and the differences began to emerge more clearly after Lily's birth. At home, behind the closed doors of our sprawling house in the historic district, Michael had very different expectations about how his wife should dress and behave. The conservative blazers and sensible shoes gave way to silk negligées and elaborate lingerie sets he selected with the same careful attention he applied to his legal briefs. He photographed me constantly in these intimate moments, claiming he needed the images for when he traveled on business. The camera became as much a part of our bedroom as the antique four-poster bed he'd inherited from his great-grandmother. I told myself this was normal. Married couples were intimate. Husbands found their wives attractive. The fact that he seemed to need visual proof of my desire for him was simply evidence of how much he loved me, how much he needed me. When he shared certain photos with his law school buddies during their monthly poker games, I convinced myself it was just masculine boasting, the harmless bragging rights of a man proud of his beautiful wife. The first crack in my willful blindness came in the spring of 2023 when I discovered Michael's affair with Jennifer Williams, his 24-year-old paralegal. I hadn't been looking for evidence of infidelity. I'd been searching for a recipe in his email when I found the messages, dozens of them, spanning 6 months. Michael's communications with Jennifer revealed a side of my husband I'd never seen. Playful, passionate, utterly devoted. He wrote to her about their future together, about the life they would build once he'd handled the Anna situation with minimal financial damage. He shared intimate details about our marriage, our sex life, our private moments. Most damaging of all, he'd sent her several of the photos he'd taken of me, describing them as proof of his sexual prowess and his wife's complete submission. I sat in his home office that afternoon, staring at the computer screen while 18-month-old Lily napped upstairs, and felt my carefully constructed world collapse around me. The man I'd reshaped my entire identity to please had been treating me like a trophy to be displayed, a possession to be managed, a problem to be solved. That night, when Michael returned from what he'd claimed was a client dinner, I confronted him with the evidence. His reaction was swift and calculated, the response of a lawyer trained to minimize liability and control narrative. He didn't deny the affair. Instead, he explained it. Jennifer understood his needs, he said. She appreciated his success and didn't burden him with constant demands for attention or validation. Unlike me, she didn't question his decisions or challenge his authority. She was young, ambitious, grateful for his mentorship, both professional and personal. Most importantly, she didn't expect him to pretend their relationship was about love when it was really about compatibility and mutual benefit. As for the photos, Michael dismissed my outrage with the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to winning arguments through intimidation. Those images, he explained, were his property. I was his wife. My body, my sexuality, my intimate moments, all of it belonged to him by virtue of our marriage vows. If I didn't want him sharing evidence of our private life, perhaps I should consider why I was so ashamed of being an attractive, sexually available wife. The conversation ended with Michael's ultimatum. I could accept the reality of our marriage and learn to coexist peacefully with his relationship with Jennifer, or I could face the social and financial devastation of a divorce in which he would ensure I lost everything that mattered. I chose divorce. The decision wasn't impulsive. I spent 3 weeks researching attorneys, documenting assets, and quietly preparing for the legal battle I knew was coming. Michael's confidence in his ability to control the narrative wasn't unfounded. He had connections throughout the Albany legal community, significant financial resources, and a reputation for being a devoted family man. I was a part-time elementary school art teacher with limited savings and a history of deferring to my husband's judgment. But Michael had made one crucial mistake in his assessment of my capabilities. He'd underestimated my capacity for strategic thinking. During our marriage, while he'd been busy molding me into his ideal wife, I'd been quietly observing his methods. I'd learned how he prepared for court cases, how he gathered evidence, how he identified his opponent's weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision. I'd watched him destroy business rivals and legal adversaries with careful documentation and patient planning. Most importantly, I'd learned that the most devastating attacks often came from directions the victim never saw coming. I hired Patricia Williams, no relation to Jennifer, a divorce attorney from Valdosta who specialized in high-conflict custody cases involving manipulation and control. Patricia was 62 years old, a grandmother who dressed like a librarian and spoke with the soft drawl of someone who'd never raised her voice in court. She was also, I would soon discover, absolutely ruthless in protecting her female clients from predatory ex-husbands. Patricia's strategy was elegantly simple. We would let Michael believe he was winning while we systematically documented every aspect of his controlling behavior. She advised me to comply with his demands about my appearance and behavior during our separation, to seem appropriately remorseful about my decision to seek divorce, to give him no obvious ammunition to use against me in court. Meanwhile, we would be building a comprehensive case that revealed the true nature of our marriage and his character. The separation period was the most difficult 18 months of my adult life. Michael moved in with Jennifer but maintained his parental rights, picking up Lily every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. He used these visits as opportunities to interrogate our 2-year-old daughter about my activities, my friends, my behavior. He hired a private investigator to document my comings and goings, hoping to find evidence of moral unfitness or financial irresponsibility. He had his lawyer file motion after motion designed to drain my limited resources and force me into a settlement favorable to him. Throughout this period, Michael maintained his public image as the wronged husband trying to protect his child from an unstable mother. He spoke sadly to mutual friends about my breakdown following Lily's birth, my inability to handle the pressures of marriage and motherhood, my sudden rebellion against the values we'd shared. He painted himself as the patient, long-suffering spouse who'd tried everything to save our marriage before finally accepting that divorce was inevitable. I played my assigned role perfectly. I attended mediation sessions where I appeared overwhelmed and grateful for Michael's willingness to provide financial support. I dressed conservatively for every court appearance, spoke softly when questioned, and generally embodied the image of a confused young mother who'd made a regrettable decision but was learning to accept her ex-husband's superior judgment about their daughter's needs. What Michael didn't know was that Patricia and I were documenting everything. Every demand about my appearance, every attempt to control my behavior, every casual cruelty disguised as concern for Lily's well-being. All of it went into a file that grew thicker by the week. Patricia had also hired her own investigator, a former police detective named Robert Hayes who specialized in uncovering hidden assets and documenting infidelity. Robert's findings painted a picture of Michael's double life that went far beyond his relationship with Jennifer. The photography, it turned out, was just the beginning. Michael had been sharing intimate images of me with multiple people over the course of our marriage: law school friends, business associates, even some of his clients. He'd created what amounted to a private collection of documentation about our sex life, complete with detailed written descriptions of our most private moments. Some of these materials had been stored on cloud servers accessible to his law firm's IT department. Others had been printed and kept in a locked file cabinet in his home office, like trophies from a successful conquest. Patricia's investigation also revealed the extent of Michael's financial manipulation during our marriage. The joint accounts I believed represented our shared assets were actually structured to give him complete control over our finances. The house, the cars, even Lily's college fund were all in his name alone. My own income from teaching had been deposited into accounts he managed, leaving me with no independent financial resources and no legal claim to assets I'd helped accumulate through my unpaid domestic labor. Most damaging of all was evidence of Michael's long-term planning for our divorce. Messages between him and Jennifer revealed that he'd been strategizing about how to minimize his financial obligations to me since early in our marriage. He discussed moving assets offshore, claiming mental health issues on my part, and even potentially seeking sole custody of Lily based on fabricated evidence of maternal unfitness. The affair wasn't an impulsive mistake. It was part of a calculated plan to replace me with a more compliant partner while avoiding the financial consequences of his decision. As our final court date approached, Michael grew increasingly confident about the outcome. He'd successfully painted me as an unstable woman who'd abandoned her family responsibilities for selfish reasons. His legal team had filed extensive documentation about my erratic behavior during our separation, including my decision to cut my hair shorter get a small tattoo on my wrist, and take a full-time position at the regional medical center working with trauma survivors. These changes, according to Michael's narrative, represented evidence of my mental instability and unfitness as a mother. The night before our final hearing, Michael sent me a text message that would become crucial evidence in Patricia's case. It was brief and typically controlling. Dress modestly tomorrow. Conservative suit. We need the judge to see you as a proper wife and mother. This is important, Anna. I read the message while sitting in the small apartment I'd rented near downtown Albany, surrounded by moving boxes and Lily's drawings from daycare. The audacity of his continued attempts to control my appearance, even as we were about to legally end our marriage, crystallized everything I'd learned about his character over the past 7 years. He truly believed that he could manipulate any situation, control any person, win any battle through the sheer force of his will and social advantages. Tomorrow, I would show him exactly how wrong he was. The morning of our final hearing dawned clear and cold, typical for February in South Georgia. I dressed exactly as Michael had instructed: conservative black suit, white blouse buttoned to the neck, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a neat chignon. I looked like the perfect portrait of a repentant wife seeking her husband's forgiveness and the court's mercy. The crimson silk lingerie beneath my conservative exterior was invisible to everyone in the courthouse, but I felt its presence like armor. It reminded me of who I'd been when I allowed Michael to photograph me in moments of artificial intimacy. It reminded me of the woman who'd believed that love meant surrendering her agency to someone else's vision of perfection. Most importantly, it reminded me that I would never again allow anyone to use my own desires and vulnerabilities against me. Patricia met me in the courthouse lobby, looking as innocuous as ever in her navy blue dress and sensible shoes. She carried a slim briefcase that contained 18 months of careful documentation, along with several surprises that Michael's legal team hadn't anticipated. Her strategy for today was simple. Let Michael's attorneys present their case first, allow them to feel confident about their narrative, then systematically dismantle every assumption they'd made about the evidence and my character. Michael arrived 30 minutes later with his full legal team, 3 attorneys from Thompson and Associates, along with Jennifer Williams serving as their paralegal. He dressed for victory in his most expensive charcoal suit, radiating the confidence of a man who'd never lost a case that mattered to him. Jennifer wore a tasteful burgundy dress that managed to convey both professionalism and subtle sexuality, the perfect costume for the woman who would soon replace me in Michael's public narrative. Judge Rebecca Martinez presided over our hearing with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who'd seen every possible variation of marital dissolution during her 15 years on the bench. She was known for her fairness, her intolerance of legal theatrics, and her particular disdain for attorneys who attempted to manipulate proceedings through emotional manipulation rather than factual evidence. Michael's lead attorney, James Patterson, opened with a presentation that was masterful in its calculated emotional appeal. He painted Michael as a devoted father trying to protect his young daughter from a mother who'd suffered what he termed a significant personality change following the breakdown of their marriage. According to Patterson's narrative, I had abandoned the values and lifestyle that had defined our family in favor of a selfish pursuit of independence that prioritized my personal desires over Lily's need for stability. Patterson presented evidence of my erratic behavior during our separation. The job change, the new haircut, the small tattoo, my decision to move out of our family home into a modest apartment. He characterized these changes as evidence of mental instability, suggesting that I was going through some form of delayed adolescent rebellion that made me unfit for primary custody of a young child. Michael took the witness stand with the polished confidence of someone who testified as an expert witness in dozens of cases. His presentation was flawless: the concerned father, the responsible provider, the patient ex-husband who'd tried everything to save his marriage before accepting that some people simply couldn't handle the responsibilities of adult life. He spoke about his love for Lily, his commitment to providing her with the stable, traditional home environment she needed, his willingness to allow me generous visitation rights despite my obvious unfitness for primary custody. When Patterson asked about our marriage, Michael's answers were carefully crafted to suggest that he'd been a loving, supportive husband whose only mistake had been enabling my increasingly self-destructive behavior. He claimed that I'd become resentful of his success, jealous of his relationship with Jennifer, and determined to punish him for refusing to support what he called my feminist awakening at the expense of our family's well-being. The performance was masterful, and I could see Judge Martinez taking careful notes as Michael spoke. His testimony hit all the right notes for a conservative Southern judge: the importance of traditional family values, the need to protect children from unstable parents, the tragedy of a marriage destroyed by one partner's selfish refusal to honor her commitments. Then it was my turn. Patricia's questioning began gently, allowing me to tell the story of our marriage from my perspective. I described the gradual erosion of my independence, the way Michael had systematically isolated me from friends and career opportunities, his increasing demands for control over every aspect of my appearance and behavior. I spoke about discovering his affair, his reaction to my confrontation, and his ultimatum that I either accept his relationship with Jennifer or face complete financial and social destruction. Judge Martinez listened carefully as I described Michael's photography hobby and his habit of sharing intimate images without my consent. I explained how I discovered the extent of his documentation only during the divorce proceedings, when Patricia's investigation had revealed the true scope of his violations of my privacy and dignity. Throughout my testimony, Michael maintained his expression of patient concern, occasionally shaking his head sadly at my distortions of our marriage. His attorneys objected frequently to questions they claimed were irrelevant to custody determination, but Judge Martinez allowed most of Patricia's inquiries to proceed. The first major surprise came when Patricia introduced Michael's text message instructing me to dress modestly for today's hearing. She asked me to explain the context of this communication, and I described the pattern of control it represented, how Michael had always dictated my appearance based on the impression he wanted to create, how he'd trained me to see my own body and presentation as tools for his use rather than expressions of my authentic self. Patterson objected that Michael's concern about courtroom appearance was simply good legal strategy, but Judge Martinez noted that the message seemed to assume an ongoing right to control my choices even after our separation. The second surprise was Patricia's introduction of evidence about Michael's sharing of intimate photographs during our marriage. She presented testimony from Robert Hayes, her investigator, who had documented the extent of Michael's distribution of private images. The evidence included statements from several recipients of these photos, along with detailed documentation of Michael's cloud storage accounts and the private files in his home office. Michael's reaction to this revelation was swift and telling. He immediately began whispering urgently with his attorneys, his confident demeanor evaporating as he realized the scope of Patricia's investigation. Patterson attempted to argue that the photographic evidence was irrelevant to custody determination, but Judge Martinez seemed particularly interested in the question of consent and Michael's pattern of treating intimate materials as his personal property. The third and most devastating surprise came when Patricia called Jennifer Williams to the witness stand. What Michael didn't know was that Jennifer had been cooperating with Patricia's investigation for the past 6 months. Her relationship with Michael had soured considerably once she'd realized that his promises about their future together were contingent on his ability to avoid significant financial obligations to me. More importantly, she'd become uncomfortable with his expectation that she participate in the same kind of intimate documentation that had characterized his marriage to me. Jennifer's testimony revealed the extent of Michael's manipulation and planning regarding our divorce. She described conversations in which he discussed various strategies for minimizing his financial obligations, including potential claims about my mental health, my fitness as a mother, and my supposed abandonment of Lily. She provided documentation of Michael's attempts to hide assets, including his discussions about offshore accounts and business structures that would shield his wealth from divorce proceedings. Most damaging of all was Jennifer's testimony about Michael's reaction to my decision to seek divorce. According to her account, Michael had been confident that he could control the proceedings through a combination of social pressure, financial intimidation, and legal maneuvering. He'd bragged about his ability to manipulate judges and juries, his connections within the Albany legal community, and his certainty that no judge would award primary custody to a woman who'd abandoned her traditional role as wife and mother. Jennifer also testified about Michael's continued attempts to control my behavior during our separation. She described his anger when I'd cut my hair, his fury about my new job, his obsessive monitoring of my activities through the private investigator, and his interrogation of Lily after visitation periods. According to Jennifer, Michael saw my growing independence as a personal affront that required correction rather than acceptance. By the time Patricia finished her presentation, Michael's carefully constructed narrative had collapsed entirely. The devoted father and wronged husband had been revealed as a controlling manipulator who treated his marriage as a business arrangement and his wife as a piece of property to be managed and displayed for his benefit. Michael's rebuttal testimony was a disaster. Under Patricia's cross-examination, he became defensive, angry, and ultimately revealed the sense of entitlement that had driven his behavior throughout our marriage. He couldn't understand why sharing photos of his own wife should be considered a violation. He couldn't grasp why his financial planning for our divorce represented anything other than prudent self-protection. Most tellingly, he couldn't accept that my changes during our separation represented genuine personal growth rather than a calculated attack on his authority. Judge Martinez's decision was swift and comprehensive. I was awarded primary custody of Lily, with Michael receiving supervised visitation until he completed court-mandated counseling about appropriate boundaries and parental behavior. I received the house, significant spousal support, and primary control over Lily's college fund. Most importantly, the judge issued a restraining order preventing Michael from any further distribution of intimate images and requiring him to delete all such materials from his personal files. In her written decision, Judge Martinez noted that Michael's pattern of control and manipulation raised serious concerns about his ability to prioritize Lily's emotional well-being over his own need for dominance. She specifically cited his text message about my courtroom attire as evidence of his ongoing attempts to control my behavior and his fundamental misunderstanding of appropriate post-divorce boundaries. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me as I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, still wearing the conservative suit that had hidden my rebellion beneath its proper exterior. Michael had gotten exactly what he'd asked for, a modestly dressed ex-wife who'd followed his instructions to the letter. He'd simply failed to anticipate that his own demands would become evidence of the controlling behavior that ultimately destroyed his case. The immediate aftermath of our court victory was both exhilarating and overwhelming. As Patricia and I gathered our materials in the courthouse hallway, Michael's legal team huddled around him near the elevators, their voices low and urgent. I caught fragments of their conversation, appeals, procedural errors, grounds for reversal, but their words lacked conviction. Even James Patterson, Michael's lead attorney and a man renowned for his ability to salvage hopeless cases, seemed to understand that they'd been outmaneuvered so completely that recovery was impossible. Michael himself stood apart from his advisors, staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Gone was the confident superiority that had characterized his demeanor throughout our marriage and separation. In its place was something that looked almost like bewilderment, as if he were seeing me clearly for the first time and couldn't reconcile this strategic, prepared woman with the compliant wife he'd thought he understood. Jennifer Williams had disappeared immediately after her testimony, slipping out of the courthouse through a side exit while Michael was still processing the scope of her betrayal. Her cooperation with Patricia's investigation had been the final nail in his legal coffin, but I suspected her motivations were more complex than simple revenge. During our brief conversation before her testimony, she'd spoken about her growing discomfort with Michael's expectations and his assumption that she would participate in the same patterns of control and documentation that had characterized his marriage to me. Patricia walked me to my car, carrying the briefcase that had contained our victory. She was already thinking ahead to the practical implications of Judge Martinez's ruling, the timeline for asset transfer, the logistics of supervised visitation. But I was still processing the emotional weight of what had just occurred. For 18 months, I'd been playing a role, carefully crafting an image of compliance while secretly building the case that would free me from Michael's control. The performance was finally over, and I wasn't entirely sure who I was without it. That evening, I picked up Lily from my neighbor Susan Rodriguez, an elderly widow who'd become my unofficial grandmother figure during our separation. Susan had witnessed the gradual erosion of my marriage from her front porch across the street, watching as I'd become increasingly isolated and subdued while Michael's confidence had grown more pronounced. She'd been one of the few people who'd consistently encouraged me to trust my instincts about his behavior, even when I'd been too afraid or confused to act on my growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with our relationship. Lily bounded into my arms with the enthusiasm of a 3-year-old who didn't understand the adult complications that had been swirling around her life. She chattered about her day with Susan, the cookies they'd baked, the story they'd read about a princess who saved herself from a dragon using her own cleverness rather than waiting for rescue. The innocence of her joy was both heartbreaking and healing. She had no idea that today had been the day her parents' marriage officially ended, or that her future had been decided by lawyers and judges in a room she'd never seen. As I tucked her into bed that night, Lily asked when Daddy would be coming home. It was a question she'd been asking with increasing frequency during our separation, and one I'd never known how to answer without either lying or burdening her with adult complexities beyond her understanding. Tonight, for the first time, I was able to give her a truthful response that felt like hope rather than evasion. I explained that Daddy wouldn't be living with us anymore, but that he would still see her regularly, and that both of us loved her very much. I told her that sometimes parents need to live in different houses to be happier and healthier people, and that our family would look different now but would still be a family. She nodded solemnly, processing this information with the remarkable adaptability of childhood, then asked if we could paint her bedroom purple now that Daddy wasn't there to insist on appropriate colors for young ladies. The question caught me off guard, revealing how much Lily had absorbed about the restrictions that had governed our household during Michael's presence. Even at 3 years old, she'd internalized his rules about what was acceptable for females in his family. The realization that his controlling behavior had already begun to shape her understanding of her own possibilities was both infuriating and motivating. I was determined that she would grow up knowing she had the right to make her own choices about everything from bedroom colors to career paths to the kind of relationships she would accept in her life. The weeks following our court victory were a whirlwind of practical adjustments. Michael moved out of Jennifer's apartment and into a modest rental house on the outskirts of Albany, his financial resources severely constrained by the spousal support payments and legal fees. Thompson and Associates had officially terminated his partnership after his father discovered the extent of his professional misconduct, including his use of firm resources for personal legal matters and his violation of client confidentiality agreements during his relationship with Jennifer. The Albany legal community, despite its traditional Southern courtesy, was surprisingly quick to distance itself from Michael once the details of his behavior became public knowledge. Word spread rapidly through the network of attorneys, judges, and court personnel about his treatment of me during our marriage and his attempts to manipulate the divorce proceedings. Several clients withdrew their business from Thompson and Associates, specifically citing their disapproval of Michael's conduct, forcing his father to consider whether the family firm could survive the scandal his son had created. I found myself in the unexpected position of being something of a local celebrity, though not always in ways that felt comfortable. The story of our divorce, the controlling husband, the secret evidence, the courtroom reversal, had captured the imagination of Albany's gossip network. Some people viewed me as a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging traditional gender roles, while others saw me as an inspiration for women trapped in similar situations. Both reactions felt reductive, turning the complex reality of my experience into a simple narrative that served other people's preconceptions rather than honoring the actual difficulty of what I'd endured and accomplished. More meaningful was the response from other women who'd recognized elements of their own experiences in my story. I began receiving phone calls and letters from wives who'd never questioned their husband's control until they heard about my case. Some were dealing with financial manipulation, others with social isolation, still others with the kind of intimate violations that Michael had practiced throughout our marriage. Many of these women were seeking advice about their legal options, but just as many seemed to need permission to trust their instincts about relationships that felt wrong even when they couldn't articulate exactly why. These conversations led me to begin volunteering at the Albany Family Violence Prevention Center, where I helped develop workshops for women navigating the early stages of separation from controlling partners. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply satisfying, allowing me to transform my own painful experience into something that might prevent other women from enduring similar abuse. I learned to speak publicly about psychological manipulation and financial control, topics that had once felt too shameful to discuss even with close friends. Patricia became not just my attorney but a genuine friend during this period, someone who understood both the legal and emotional complexities of what I'd endured. She'd handled dozens of similar cases during her career, and she helped me understand that Michael's behavior followed predictable patterns that had little to do with my individual failings and everything to do with his need to maintain dominance through control. Her guidance was invaluable as I learned to distinguish between appropriate compromise in relationships and the kind of systematic erosion of autonomy that had characterized my marriage. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I received word that Michael had declared bankruptcy. The combination of legal fees, spousal support payments, and loss of income from Thompson and Associates had made his financial position untenable. Jennifer had left him shortly after his professional downfall became public knowledge, taking with her not only the clients she'd convinced to follow her to a competing firm, but also the expensive jewelry and gifts he'd lavished on her during their relationship. The woman who'd once seemed like the perfect replacement for his troublesome wife had proven to be just as calculating as he was, abandoning him the moment his resources and social status disappeared. I found that I felt sorry for him, which surprised me. The man who'd once seemed so powerful, so certain of his ability to control any situation, had been undone by his own assumptions about what he was entitled to take from the people who loved him. He'd treated our marriage like a hostile takeover rather than a partnership, and ultimately faced the same fate as any predator who underestimates his prey. But there was something tragic about watching someone destroy everything meaningful in their life through their inability to see other people as anything more than objects to be managed and manipulated. Michael's supervised visitation with Lily took place at a family services center in downtown Albany, a sterile but safe environment where trained counselors could monitor his interactions with our daughter. The early sessions were awkward and stilted, filled with his attempts to question Lily about my activities and her obvious confusion about why Daddy seemed so different now. But gradually, with the guidance of the family counselors, he began to focus more on simply being present with her rather than gathering intelligence or asserting control. Watching him learn to interact with Lily as a person rather than an extension of himself was both heartening and heartbreaking. He'd missed so much of her personality development during our marriage because he'd been too focused on molding her into his idea of what a Thompson daughter should be. Now, faced with court-mandated limitations on his parental authority, he was discovering the joy of simply listening to her chatter about her interests and observations. It was a relationship dynamic he'd never experienced with me, and I sometimes wondered if our marriage might have been different if he'd been capable of this kind of genuine engagement with my thoughts and feelings. The house that had once been our family home underwent a gradual transformation as Lily and I made it truly ours. Michael's home office became my art therapy studio, a bright, welcoming space filled with easels, art supplies, and comfortable seating for the clients who came to work with me. The formal living room where he'd entertain business associates became Lily's playroom, cluttered with toys, books, and the creative chaos of childhood. The dining room, where we'd hosted stilted dinner parties for his colleagues, became a workspace where I prepared materials for my workshops and wrote articles about recognizing and recovering from psychological abuse. Most symbolically, I converted the master bedroom where Michael had photographed me in those elaborate lingerie sets into a peaceful sanctuary that reflected my own preferences rather than his sexual fantasies. Gone were the heavy, dark furniture and dramatic lighting he'd preferred for his intimate documentation. In their place, I chose soft colors, natural fabrics, and furniture that prioritized comfort and personal space over visual impact. The room became a place where I could think, read, and simply exist without performing any version of femininity for someone else's consumption. My art therapy practice grew rapidly, fueled partly by referrals from Patricia and other divorce attorneys who recognized the value of helping their clients process trauma through creative expression. I worked with women recovering from various forms of domestic abuse, but also with children navigating their parents' divorces, men learning to rebuild their identities after professional failures, and elderly clients processing grief and loss. The work was challenging and emotionally demanding, but it felt authentically mine in ways that my previous attempts to build a career around Michael's expectations had never achieved. The therapeutic process of helping others reclaim their stories after experiences of control and manipulation deepened my understanding of my own journey. I began to see how Michael's behavior had followed classic patterns of psychological abuse. The initial charm and attention, the gradual isolation from friends and outside interests, the systematic erosion of self-confidence, the creation of financial dependency, and finally the threats of devastating consequences for any attempt to leave. Understanding these patterns helped me process my own experience with less shame and self-blame, recognizing that his manipulation had been skillful and deliberate rather than evidence of my personal weakness or failure. One of the most healing aspects of my new life was the gradual rebuilding of friendships that had withered during my marriage. Michael had subtly discouraged my relationships with other women, particularly those who might have questioned his control or offered alternative perspectives on our dynamic. He'd been especially hostile toward friends who worked in helping professions or who'd maintained their independence after marriage, claiming they had negative influences on my contentment with our traditional arrangement. Reconnecting with these women was both joyful and painful, as I realized how much of my authentic self I'd lost during the years of trying to become Michael's ideal wife. Some friendships resumed easily, picking up conversations that had been interrupted by my gradual withdrawal from social connections. Others required more work, as I had to acknowledge how I'd hurt people by choosing my husband's approval over their friendship. A few relationships couldn't be repaired, the damage from years of canceled plans and unanswered calls too extensive to overcome. But new friendships also emerged, particularly with other single mothers who understood the challenges of rebuilding life after divorce. These relationships were different from my pre-marriage friendships, grounded in shared experiences of resilience and recovery rather than the casual compatibility of youth. We supported each other through practical challenges like childcare and financial stress, but also through the emotional work of rediscovering our individual identities after years of defining ourselves primarily in relation to our husbands. Lily thrived in this new environment, her personality blossoming in ways that had been subtly constrained during Michael's presence in our home. She became more talkative, more creative, more willing to express preferences and opinions that differed from adult expectations. Her artwork, which had previously been careful and conventional, became bold and imaginative. Her play became more adventurous and less concerned with maintaining perfect behavior. Most importantly, she began to express her own desires and boundaries with confidence, secure in the knowledge that her feelings would be respected rather than managed or dismissed. The contrast between Lily's development in our home and her behavior during visits with Michael was striking. The family counselors noted that she became more subdued and anxious before scheduled visits, reverting to the careful compliance that had characterized her behavior during our marriage. Michael's inability to interact with her authentically, even under professional supervision, revealed how deeply his need for control affected every relationship in his life. 2 years after our divorce, I received an unexpected phone call from Michael. His voice was different, quieter, less certain, stripped of the commanding tone that had once intimidated me into compliance. He was calling to ask if we could meet to discuss Lily's upcoming enrollment in kindergarten, but the conversation quickly evolved into something more personal. He wanted to apologize, he said, though he struggled to articulate exactly what he was apologizing for. The therapy mandated by the court had forced him to confront behaviors and attitudes he'd never questioned, and he was beginning to understand the damage his need for control had caused to everyone around him. He spoke about his relationship with his own father, the pressure to maintain the Thompson family reputation, the way he'd learned to view relationships as competitions to be won rather than connections to be nurtured. I listened to his words with a mixture of compassion and wariness. The changes in his tone and perspective seemed genuine, but I learned not to trust my ability to distinguish between authentic transformation and skillful manipulation where Michael was concerned. More importantly, I discovered that forgiveness didn't require me to re-engage with someone who'd caused me harm, even if that person had genuinely changed. I thanked him for his apology and acknowledged that I could see he was working to become a better person, particularly as a father to Lily. But I also made it clear that our relationship would remain limited to co-parenting responsibilities, and that my willingness to work cooperatively with him was contingent on his continued respect for the boundaries established by our divorce decree. He accepted these limitations without argument, perhaps finally understanding that his preferences about our relationship were no longer the determining factor in how it would function. Today, 4 years after that final court hearing, Lily and I live in the house that was once our family home, but now feels entirely our own. She's 6 years old and thriving in first grade, showing no signs of the instability Michael's attorneys had claimed to fear. Her relationship with her father has improved significantly as he's learned to focus on her needs rather than his own agenda, though their interactions remain structured and supervised to ensure her emotional safety. I've expanded my art therapy practice to include group workshops for women recovering from psychological abuse, and I've begun writing a book about recognizing and healing from covert forms of domestic violence. The work is challenging and sometimes triggering, as it requires me to revisit my own experiences of manipulation and control, but it feels like the most meaningful use of everything I learned during those dark years of my marriage. The crimson silk lingerie set still hangs in my closet, though it serves a different purpose now than it did during my marriage. It's a reminder of who I was when I believed that love required the surrender of my authentic self, and who I became when I learned that the most radical act of self-respect is refusing to let someone else's expectations define your worth. Sometimes I look at it and remember the woman who wore it for someone else's pleasure, seeking approval through performance rather than connection through authenticity. The conservative suit from that final court hearing is long gone, donated to a women's shelter where other women are learning to rebuild their lives after escaping controlling relationships. But I remember the feeling of wearing exactly what Michael demanded while carrying the evidence of his downfall hidden beneath the surface, invisible to his calculating eyes until the moment his own expectations finally destroyed him. I've learned that recovery from psychological abuse is not a linear process, but an ongoing journey of rediscovering who you are when you're not trying to be what someone else wants you to be. Some days I feel strong and confident, secure in my independence and proud of what I've accomplished. Other days I catch myself falling into old patterns of seeking external validation or doubting my own perceptions and decisions. But the difference now is that I recognize these moments for what they are: temporary setbacks rather than permanent failures, echoes of old trauma rather than evidence of current weakness. I have tools for managing these challenges, support systems to help me maintain perspective, and most importantly, a clear understanding of my own worth that no longer depends on anyone else's approval or assessment. Sometimes the most modest thing you can do is let someone else's assumptions about your compliance become the weapon that sets you free. Sometimes the greatest victory is discovering that the person who tried to make you smaller actually taught you exactly how strong you really were. And sometimes, when you dress exactly as someone demands while hiding your true power beneath the surface, you learn that the most dangerous thing about underestimating someone is how completely it blinds you to what they're capable of doing once they stop seeking your approval and start seeking justice instead. The lingerie was never really about the fabric or the lace or the way it made my body look. It was about the choice to wear it, for my own reasons, on my own terms, as an expression of my own desires rather than a performance of someone else's expectations. Recovery, I've learned, is about reclaiming that power of choice in every aspect of your life, from the clothes you wear to the work you do to the love you give and receive. And that, perhaps, is the most modest expectation of all: the simple, radical belief that you deserve to be seen and loved for exactly who you are, without modification, without performance, without apology.